Great to have Luc Adamson join us today. Luc recently founded his own recruiting and advisory business, Aura Talent, focusing on supporting early stage startups tackling their hiring challenges. Prior to setting up Aura, Luc led Talent and People for Lottie, the startup helping families to find and fund elder care. And before that, Luc led Talent for Let's Do This, the product that helps individuals discover and book endurance events and races. Welcome, Luc. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Paddy.
Awesome. So to kick off, would love to know, back over your career at Aura, at Lottie, and Let's Do This, tell me about the most memorable, the favourite, the best hire that you've ever made.
So the most memorable hire I made, it's an easy one really. It was at Lottie. We had a referral hire. I got a message one morning from someone saying they're interested in Lottie. Could we have a call? I think it was a content manager position. But anyway, I jumped on a call, had a chat with him, and it turns out he'd heard one of our sales team chatting very loudly on the train after a few drinks about how good it was to work at Lottie. So he thought this place sounded amazing. He found who the head of talent was at Lottie, got in touch with me, and the rest is history, really. We hired him, and it took us a while to work out who the drunk salesperson was on the train, but ultimately we did, and she got the referral fee for it.
Love that. What made that person the favourite hire for you? Was it just the story of how they got into the business, or was it what they did when they arrived?
It's actually ultimately it's the story, but he turned out to be a great hire. He sort of was a good content manager and still is like a really good content manager, but he became Lottie's, I guess you call it our host. He is like the face of Lottie, does all our content. He became like a content creator alongside a content manager. I think he's an ex-comedian as well, so he does all our like hosting on the big Lottie days, or when I used to work at Lottie anyway. But yeah, so great hire, great story. I think overall it was a bit of a standout.
Love that. Awesome. Thinking back over the hires that you've made across the various companies you've helped, in your mind, what's the difference between a good hire and a great one?
So I think for me, the difference between a good hire and a great hire, it often comes down to behaviors. So values, behaviors, whatever you want to call it, soft competencies. I think for me, it's hard to isolate specific behaviors. I think it's like a few behaviors and a few that I have always noticed and always like looked out for. Things like, particularly in a startup, things like ownership, adaptability, and above all else, like a desire to learn and be really great at what you do, like taking pride in being brilliant. And I think those three things is rare to have someone that has two but not the other. Like they just kind of come as a package, and they're the things that sort of set people apart. And I think this is probably recency bias, but there's a lady who works at Lottie who's a senior people partner there, and I think when we were interviewing, like she was very good and competent skills wise, like experience wise, but you know, not a standout. But it was the behaviours that made her great rather than good. And I think as soon as she joined Lottie, it's very clear that she just had this desire to be really brilliant and learn and grow. And I think the the thing that stands out the most is that she came in and said she didn't like doing presentation skills, that she didn't like speaking in front of crowds. 2 years later, she does all our all hands. She goes on podcasts, she goes on panel shows, and she just wanted to get better. There's just like behavior to get better and learn and be great. So yeah, recency bias, but that's the one that sort of sticks in my mind.
Awesome. When you're in the interview process or that first screen, or maybe even just on the CV, how do you try and get that signal? Is that something you can pick up? Like, where do you first notice those behaviors that you think are so important?
Yeah, I suppose they're slightly intangible, but I think you can see trajectory on someone's CV. You can sort of see, promotions. They've progressed. They're sort of clearly having success in their career. The way they write their CV, like talking about impact and the things they did and like what they specifically did, I think that comes through as well. And I guess it's just an experience of seeing thousands and thousands of CVs that you get an instinct for the ones that look right, look good. And then obviously it comes down to the actual screen call where you can really start to like drill into these things.
Okay. And in the screening call, what specifically are you trying to drill into? What stands out to you?
For those behaviors, I suppose if we take ownership, like you can get a feel for it just while they're speaking and talking about what they've done. You can get a feel for the impact they had. They talk about the metrics success metrics for projects they've done, and they talk about how those metrics link to like commercial success. And so that's the impact thing. But then going deep into what they actually did and like what they did, how that drove something else, you could sort of get it through a general question and answer, or you can go quite specific on these things, and you can do evidence-based interview questioning where you say, tell me about a time that you showed ownership. Like often that doesn't always happen in a 20-30 minute screen, but if you really want to drill down into those things, you can do it that way as well.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Thinking about the roles that you've hired, obviously you've hired across a very diverse set of companies doing very different things. What's been the most challenging role that you've ever worked?
So the most challenging role I've ever worked on, there's always tricky roles, like you're always going to come up against, particularly if you're an all-round recruiter, when you get chucked a finance controller or something like that, or an implementation lead, like they're difficult because it's a niche role and it's a market that you've probably not, or a network you've not got there. But the one that really stands out was probably about 3 or 4 years ago when I was at Let's Do This. We had a data scientist role. Let's Do This. It was an extremely high talent bar, really great caliber candidates. And this role was just impossible. And we just kept sort of getting to the end and not finding the right person. And on reflection, I think the problem, what made it so difficult, is we were hiring a data analyst, but we were calling it a data scientist. And this was just kind of a thing that happened in the industry. I think it started at Deliveroo, where they called their data analyst data scientists as well. Anyway, long story short, we were looking for a data analyst, but every data scientist we spoke to wanted to be doing ML stuff or algorithm stuff, and they didn't want to be doing like A/B testing analytics. So we were basically going to market with the wrong title and the wrong description, looking for the wrong people. In the end, we ended up using an external recruitment partner. They sent us someone, and it didn't really work out, without getting into too many details. But yeah, it was difficult. It was a high pressure role. The company was desperate to hire it. We didn't really have the alignment, partly my fault, partly the hiring manager's fault. And we were just looking for the wrong thing. So yeah, that one sticks in the mind.
Yeah, difficult. There's always those challenging ones. I remember I worked an SDK product manager. This is in 2016, and I worked that role for, I can't remember how long it went on for. And we had a similar mistake the next year where I worked a product manager role for Improbable, and I worked that role for a year, and I spoke to 230 senior product managers from every kind of tech company you could imagine globally. Literally spent a year on it. And then I ended up leaving that business, and then they ended up hiring the first person I spoke to.
Yeah, classic.
So it only took about a year and a half to get it done, but it actually did happen in the end. Yeah, sometimes it can be a grind.
Yeah, and I think
No.
I was just going to say, it's that pressure from the founder wants it done really quickly, and the hiring manager does, but he's getting pressure from the founder, and we're all giving each other pressure. And that's probably what made it most difficult.
Yeah, 100%. When you think about those, those hires that haven't worked out, and that sounds like an example potentially, but when hires don't work out, what's the pattern? What similarities, what things have you observed? Is there a kind of a way that these things happen? Is there kind of like a common thread, do you think?
I think there's definitely things that keep coming up that can all lead to like a bad hire or a hire that doesn't work out. Sometimes it's just one of those things. Sometimes it's all six of things. I think there's like a variety of things that can happen. I'd say misalignment between the exec team or the founder and the hiring manager, misalignment between the hiring manager and the recruiter. I think building like pretty bad processes and not having strong assessments, inexperienced interviewers, not being trained or coached, not having a good structure. There honestly, there's a number of things, and actually it can just take one of those things to be off, and you actually end up with a 3 out of 5 rather than 5 out of 5 hire. I think for me, like the important thing is to try and like mitigate those things. If there was one common thing, I would probably say is misalignment about like what the level is, like what great looks like, how are we going to interview this person, like what should the process look like. And when there's misalignment, particularly between the hiring manager and the recruiter, you get loads of wasted time. Once it's dragged on for 4 or 5 weeks, people start to panic, hiring managers start to panic and think, right, well, we just can't get anyone good. Like, why don't we go for this person? You end up making bad decisions, and yeah, it leads to
Interesting. So you think that as processes drag on and people become a little bit more desperate, actually the where they hold the bar and how they apply the bar begins to diminish, and sort of
Uh,
that's what leads to it. I guess, like, have you ever been in a situation where, a hire was being made and you kind of had a feeling you're like, well, not too sure about this one?
Loads of times, and like that's probably uh, you know maybe when I was a little bit less experienced, that you get into that feeling as well. You're like, God, I just want to get this hire done. Like the pressure's really coming. We need this role hired quickly, and so you start to lower your standards a little bit, and the hiring manager lowers theirs a bit, and you end up having that conversation, and you both kind of egg each other on to hire the person who seems all right for it. Um, and I think that's where the mistake is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember one, particularly one that stood out to me, was there was a candidate that came through for a front end lead role, and a front end lead is always a incredibly difficult role. I found the candidate in question passed the loops, but was absolutely adamant that they were also an agile coach.
Mm.
And I remember talking to them at the time. I was kind of like, okay, like, sure, yeah, we use agile, that's great. And they're like, yeah, but I want to make sure that I can, add some of this stuff to my role. And I kind of just remember speaking to the hiring manager. And in my head, I was like, look, if they want to do some agile coaching, what's the harm? And the hiring manager was a bit warier than I, but I was like, look, we've been hiring for this role for like 4 months now. This has been a real pain. And we made the hire. And about 3 days in, they'd basically attempted to basically be an agile coach rather than being a
Yeah,
front end engineer. And I just remember sitting there with the hiring manager being like, we're going to have to resolve this. That this person probably can't stay. And I just remember thinking at that moment, it was that moment in time, I was like, look, when something like that isn't aligned as it goes in,
mm,
you're kind of kidding yourself by making the
yeah,
hire. And you're kind of all kidding yourself that it's going to be the right fit. And so, whenever I find myself in a situation where I've got that kind of feeling where I'm like, oh no, this is a bit of a risk. I think that's always one where you feel like there's a bigger likelihood of it going wrong.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. Particularly with an agile coach who wants to get in there and change the process and everything. Um,
Yeah, in a team of 4 people. Um, Moving on slightly to kind of like candidates and people applying for roles. Obviously, the market at the moment is a bit of a strange one. Companies are finding it very hard to hire, but there are people that are, looking for work, and it seems like people are missing each other in the process. What advice would you give to people that are applying for a role? What advice would you give to kind of people looking for a job right now?
you want to talk about, well, for people that are, people that are applying now and they're building their CV and they're thinking about how they're going to do an application. What I want to see as a head of talent or as a recruiter is that people are talking about the impact they had on the business. They talk about what their role was in a project, what they did themselves, and what the success metrics were of those projects. Was it successful? Why wasn't it? Was it, what were the good things? And then I think the key thing is being able to take metrics on a project, let's say trying to improve site speed or something like that, and how that actually links to the commercial goals of the business. And being able to tie those things together shows that you don't just sort of think about your role in isolation. Like you can kind of connect the dots to what you're doing. And I mean, there's loads of other things that are important, but that in particular for me, when I'm screening a candidate, I ask them, I want them to talk about that project. Um, and I guess we're talking about CV specifically here. So keep it clean, keep it concise, give me the data, give me the success metrics, but then tie it to the commercial goals of the business as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. And think about the other end of that process. Somebody that's gone through the process. They've received a job offer. What advice would you give to a candidate that's received a job offer? What top tips? What things should they think about? What things should they
Mhm.
consider?
For me personally, let's say I'm in a job and I don't have to take this other job. I'm sort of in a relatively stable position. I think the things I'd be looking for is who's going to be my manager. First and foremost, what's the quality of the team I'll be joining and the company? Yeah, people use the word talent density. Like, is it a company with good talent density? Are the senior management strong? I'd look at stuff like that for sure. How's the culture? Like, can you get a idea of it from Glassdoor or like social media? You get a good insight during the interview process, and then ultimately, if you can try and find someone to ask within the company, you get a good feel for it. And then probably the fourth one is and actually maybe the most important, is the role exciting? Like, what am I actually going to be doing on a day-to-day basis? Am I going to be learning? Is there progression? And so those are the things that I personally would look for. Um, Having said that, I think you do have to look at like needs and wants, and sometimes you do just need a job that pays a certain amount and is in the right location. Like, these are all the kind of basic factors. And so if those are fine, if you can live with those, then you start looking at the other things like culture and progression and various other things. And I think like maybe a separate point is, a lot of people want to shift careers, and a lot of people want to go from like big company to startup or vice versa. And that is where you have to make the trade-offs. Like, is it okay to maybe drop 10K in salary or go into the office more, whatever it is, and start like trading off those like needs for the ability to like completely change and do something you really want to do. And so that's maybe something to think about too.
What about offers? How would you encourage? Well, how would you sort of advise a candidate? You know, if they've received an offer, but perhaps they wanted to negotiate, how would you kind of advise them on?
Well, first of all, if you can get an understanding of what their salary brackets are, then that helps. A lot of companies put those publicly now. But I just think be true to yourself. Like, you know what you're worth. You know what you want. I think the only thing, it depends on the person. It depends if you're dealing with a founder. It depends if you're dealing with a recruiter. It's actually easier if you've gone through a third party recruiter, because they can do it on your behalf. I think the one thing I wouldn't do is move the goalpost. So if you have said that you're looking for £80,000 at the start of the process, and then you come in and say you want 90K, then I don't think that is the best way to start negotiating. But equally, if they try and push you down 10K, then say no, and sort of stick to what you think you're worth. If they could justify why you should be 10K lower, then maybe that's fair enough. But ultimately, I think stick to your guns and don't move the goalposts are probably the things that I would advise.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been in lots of negotiations with candidates, and I think the way that I would advise a candidate is to say, have a view on what you think makes sense for you. You know, find
Yeah.
data wherever you can, right? And sometimes that's easier said than done. And, sometimes it's hard to kind of get real clarity, but find as much data as you can, know what you want and know what you'll be happy with, and be polite and be transparent. I think
Transparency.
the biggest challenge I see with candidates when they negotiate is when they come into it in an adversarial position. I think what candidates sometimes don't realize is that if you've been made an offer, that company is now, to at least some degree, quite invested in you joining.
Yeah.
And so, they want you to join at that point. They couldn't be more clear. They've made you an offer. And so actually going in there and kind of like being, well, tell me what you think I'm worth, it's a really hard position to start from, because, faced by that, organizations, what do they do? Do they come back and make an offer that is slightly higher? Do they come back and make the same offer? And sometimes I've seen it kind of backfire where, companies feel like they need to be led there. If you feel that you're worth $5,000 more, say that. Say, hey, listen, I think this offer is $5,000 too low. I've looked at these data points for these reasons. This is why it matters to me. And I think when that's done in the right way, in a polite way, in a transparent way, with some information, with some justification, the very worst that can happen is the company says, no, I'm sorry, we're not willing to do that. And then you have a decision to make.
Yeah.
But I think, transparency, as you say, I think is key. What do you wish that hiring managers knew about recruitment?
I think hiring managers, to be fair to them, over the 10 years I've been doing recruitment, they seem to have got better, like generally better. Like, I think people take it more seriously now, which is great. That's the main thing. If a hiring manager wants to be good at being a hiring manager and hiring a great team, then I can kind of like overlook any of the mistakes or like the sort of things they don't understand. But if I had to pick one, I think understanding the difference between like good and great, like what, and the importance of waiting that little bit of time. And so I think sometimes they think recruiters tell them to slow down and wait for the right person because they're just trying to get you off their back. And so maybe if they understood like the difference, if we just had a few more weeks, like the pipeline we could build would be a lot better, like the quality would be a lot better. And actually by just understanding that and being a little bit more patient, obviously everyone's under pressure, I think that would result in better quality pipelines and better hiring.
Yeah, nice. I agree. And what do you wish that candidates knew about recruitment?
Possibly recency bias again here, but I think candidates sometimes don't appreciate just how many applications there are to deal with. And so think if you've got 8 roles out, and that at this current point in time, that could be 4,000 applications, and actually going down and reviewing all those, and trying to get people into the process and manage all of that is quite time consuming. I think in general most people are really understanding of that, and they're polite, and actually most of the time it's all fine, but occasionally you get some candidates who aren't like that, and you just kind of want to say, there's 4,000 applicants, it's going to take a little time to get back to you. Yeah, I think that's probably just a bit of patience, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Luc, fantastic. Thank you so much for answering those questions and sharing your wisdom and insights with us. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to having you back on in the not too distant future.
Cheers, Paddy. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you very
Good to
much.
chat.